A 7-year-old boy in a thin coat shivers in the blizzard, not to warm himself, but to shield the tiny life in his arms and his mother, who was fading away beside him. They had just had the hospital doors slammed shut in their faces. In their most desperate moment, a soldier and his shepherd dog appeared out of the whiteout. But what he did next wasn't just a simple act of rescue. It ignited a confrontation that would shake an entire system and expose a cruel truth no one wanted to believe was real. Become a part of our journey to spread kindness by subscribing to Voice of Paws, and we'd love to know where you're listening from. The snow fell on Silver Creek, Colorado, not as a gentle dusting, but as a thick, suffocating blanket. It swallowed the sounds of the small mountain town, leaving only the sharp howl of the wind as it tore through the pine-lined streets. It was a night for staying inside, for fire and warmth, but Mark was walking. At his side, moving with the silent, disciplined grace of a shadow, was Ghost. Mark, a man in his mid-30s, carried the lean strength of a former soldier in his frame, but a profound weariness lived in his eyes. He had moved to this isolated town to quiet the ghosts of his past, the ones that the wind couldn't scatter. His only constant companion was the 4-year-old German shepherd, whose coat was a striking mix of storm cloud gray and snow white. Ghost was more than a dog. He was an anchor, a calm and perceptive soul who understood the silence better than any person. Suddenly, Ghost stopped. His ears, usually relaxed, shot forward, and a low whine rumbled in his chest. He pulled lightly at the leash, his intelligent eyes fixed on a dark alcove beside the sterile, glowing entrance of the local hospital. Mark's senses sharpened instantly. He trusted the dog's instincts more than his own. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, his voice a low rasp. Ghost led him not toward the light, but into the shadows against a cold brick wall. At first, Mark saw only a heap of fabric. Then, the fabric moved, and his breath caught in his throat. A small boy, no older than 7, was hunched there. He wore a jacket far too thin for the weather, his small body acting as a fragile shield against the driving snow. In his arms, he clutched a tiny, swaddled bundle, and beside him, slumped against the wall, was a woman. She was frighteningly still, her face flushed with fever, her lips pale and cracked. This was Clara and her newborn, Samuel, though Mark did not yet know their names. The boy, Leo, looked up as Mark approached, his eyes wide not with childish fear, but with a fierce, desperate resolve that belonged on a man twice Mark's age. "Go away," Leo whispered, his voice trembling but firm. "She's just sleeping." Mark's heart fractured. He saw in the boy's defiant stare a reflection of his own deepest horror, the helplessness of watching someone fade away, unable to do a thing. That was a ghost he refused to entertain tonight. He knelt slowly, his movements calm and deliberate. He looked from the unconscious woman to the infant, then met the boy's gaze. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. The hospital doors behind them were bright, clean, and closed. Without another word, Mark reached down and gently slid his arms under the woman. She was terrifyingly light. He stood, holding her securely against his chest. "Come with me," he said to Leo, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We're going inside." He nodded for Ghost to move, and the great dog instantly fell into step beside the little boy, a silent, furry guardian leading the way out of the storm. The glass doors of the Silver Creek Medical Center slid shut behind them, muffling the blizzard's roar to a distant whisper. The lobby was painfully bright and silent, the air warm and sterile. Mark didn't slow his pace, his boots silent on the polished linoleum, as he carried Clara toward the main reception desk. Leo followed a step behind, clutching baby Samuel tightly, with Ghost walking beside him as a stoic, gray and white shield. Before they could reach the counter, a man in an impeccably tailored suit stepped into their path. His posture was rigid, his thinning hair was slicked back, and his name tag read Mr. Harrison, Administrator. His eyes, small and cold, flickered over them with disdain. "May I help you?" he asked, his tone, suggesting he very much hoped he would not have to. "This woman is unconscious," Mark said, his voice low and tight with urgency. "She's burning with fever. Her children were freezing outside. They need help now." Mr. Harrison didn't so much as glance at Clara's pale face. "Do they have insurance? Identification?" "They have nothing," Mark stated, shifting Clara's weight slightly. "But I will cover it. All of it. Just get her to a doctor." A humorless smile touched Mr. Harrison's lips. "That is not our protocol. This is a medical facility, not a charity shelter. Without the proper documentation and insurance pre-approval, I cannot admit them." Mark took a step forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "Are you telling me you'd let her die on your floor over a piece of paper?" At that moment, a new figure emerged from a brightly lit corridor. He was a tall man in his late 30s, wearing blue medical scrubs, his face etched with the exhaustion of a long shift. This was Dr. Evans, a man who had seen too much to be easily rattled. His eyes immediately assessed Clara. Then they moved to the man holding her. His professional focus dissolved into disbelief. "Mark?" he breathed, his voice cracking slightly. "Mark Jensen? I don't believe it." Mark stared back, and through the fog of years and trauma, he saw him. The young army medic he'd pulled from a smoking wreck in Kandahar. "Evans," Mark said, the name a statement of pure relief. Dr. Evans snapped into action, his voice ringing with an authority that bulldozed through protocol. "Nurse, get me a gurney and a crash cart, stat. We need warm fluids and oxygen in triage room 3 now." He completely ignored Mr. Harrison's sputtering protests. As a nurse rushed forward with a gurney, Evans looked at the administrator with cold fury. "She is my patient. He is my guest. We can discuss your paperwork after I have saved her life." As Mark carefully transferred Clara to the gurney, another nurse watched from the side. She was a young woman named Amy, with wide, idealistic eyes that were now filled with outrage. She slipped her phone from her pocket. Shielding the screen with her body, she hit record. A moment later, as Dr. Evans and his team disappeared down the hall, she stopped the video, her hands trembling. She typed a quick caption, "Soldier and 7-year-old beg. Hospital still says no," and pressed upload. The click was silent, but it would soon be heard by thousands. 3 days later, the storm outside had passed, but another one raged within the walls of the Silver Creek Medical Center. The video Nurse Amy had posted had exploded online, a wildfire of public outrage that had left the hospital's administration in full-blown panic. Mark learned all of this from Dr. Evans, but he paid it little mind. His focus was on the woman sitting up in the hospital bed, Clara. The fever had broken, but a deep fragility remained in her tired eyes. She looked at him, her voice a hoarse whisper. "We have nowhere to go." Mark had already known the answer. "Yes, you do," he said simply. "My home. It's quiet, it's safe, and it's warm, until you're back on your feet." Gratitude, raw and overwhelming, shone in her eyes, and so he brought them to the small wooden cabin he'd built with his own hands, nestled deep among the snow-laden pines. He lit a fire in the old iron stove, and as warmth finally filled the small space, a tension Mark hadn't even realized they were all carrying began to melt away. That first night was a quiet miracle. Leo, who had been a small, vigilant soldier for so long, finally surrendered to childhood. He didn't sleep in a bed, but on a thick bearskin rug before the hearth, his small body completely limp in the deep, peaceful slumber of the truly safe. Ghost lay down a few feet away, his great head resting on his paws, his watchful eyes glowing in the firelight. He was a silent promise that no harm would come to this boy. In the days that followed, the cabin became a sanctuary of healing. Clara would sit for hours in a worn rocking chair, holding baby Samuel and simply watching the flames dance. The hollows in her cheeks began to soften, and the color slowly returned to her face. One afternoon, as Mark handed her a steaming mug of tea, she looked at Leo and Ghost playing quietly on the floor, and she smiled. It was the first time Mark had seen it, a small, fragile curve of her lips, but it was as bright as the sun on snow. For Mark, the change was just as profound. The cabin, once a fortress for his solitude, was now a home. The simple acts of caring for this family, chopping wood for the stove, cooking a simple stew, listening to the soft sounds of their breathing as they slept, became a new kind of mission. The ghosts of his past had not vanished, but their angry whispers were drowned out by the gentle rhythms of this new life. For the first time in years, he felt not like a soldier haunted by his past, but like a guardian with a future to protect. For 2 weeks, a fragile peace settled over the cabin in the pines. It was a quiet, healing time, filled with the scent of pine from the fire, the sound of Leo's soft laughter as he taught Ghost a new trick, and the gentle rocking of the chair where Clara held Samuel. The life that had been violently uprooted was slowly, tentatively, setting down new roots in the warm, safe soil of Mark's home. The tranquility felt real, almost permanent. And then came the knock on the door. It was not a friendly rap, but a sharp official sound that made Ghost lift his head with a low growl. Mark opened the door to find a courier holding a thick manila envelope. It was addressed to Clara. Her hands trembled as she opened it, and as she read the first page, all the color and life that had returned to her face drained away, leaving behind a stark, familiar terror. "They found me," she whispered, the papers shaking in her hand. She explained to Mark that the documents were a formal custody petition from her wealthy, estranged parents, Richard and Eleanor Vance. They were the family who had disowned her when she chose a life of simple means over their world of calculated prestige. The legal papers were cruel and clinical, twisting her poverty and the night outside the hospital into evidence of her being an unstable and unfit mother. Despair, cold and suffocating, descended on the small cabin. How could they fight this? They had nothing. Her parents had everything: money, influence, and a team of ruthless lawyers. For a moment, the world felt just as hopeless as it had in the blizzard. But the video that had brought this new trouble also brought an unexpected salvation. The next day, a call came from a woman with a calm, steady voice. "My name is Maria Diaz," she said. "I'm a family law attorney in Denver. My partners and I saw your story. What happened was an outrage, and we would be honored to represent you, free of charge." Hope arrived like a flash of lightning. At the same time, Mark discovered an online fundraiser set up by strangers, which had already gathered thousands of dollars for their legal defense. The community they never knew they had was rising to their defense. That evening, with Miss Diaz on the phone outlining a strategy, Mark looked at Clara. Her fear was still present, but it was now met with a flicker of fighting spirit. He placed a steady hand on her shoulder, his voice ringing with the conviction of a soldier who had found a new, more important war to fight. "Thank you, Miss Diaz," he said, his words meant for both the lawyer and for Clara. "We will not let them take the children." The courtroom was a cold, wood-paneled box, the air thick with a tension that felt heavier than the winter snow. Clara sat composed at the table, while her parents' lawyer paced before the judge, painting a picture of her life as one of failure and instability. He used words like destitute and irresponsible, his voice slick with false sympathy. Beside Clara, Mark sat perfectly still, a silent mountain of support, his eyes fixed on the proceedings with a soldier's unwavering focus. After a long and grueling morning, their lawyer, Miss Diaz, called her final witness. The defense calls Leo to the stand. A whisper went through the courtroom as the small 7-year-old walked toward the witness box, his small hand briefly clutching Mark's as he passed. The opposing counsel objected, but the judge, a woman in her 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes named Judge Peterson, overruled him with a swift gesture. "The court will hear from the child," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Miss Diaz approached him gently. "Leo, can you tell the judge what it was like, that night in the snow?" In a small, clear voice that carried through the silent room, Leo spoke. He didn't talk about legal concepts or parental fitness. He talked about how cold the snow was, and how his baby brother wouldn't stop shivering. He talked about the bright, warm hospital door that wouldn't open, Then Miss Diaz asked her final question. "And what is it like now, Leo, living in Mark's cabin?" Leo looked past the lawyers, past his mother, and directly at the judge. "It's warm," he said simply. "Ghost sleeps next to my bed so I don't have bad dreams. And my mom," she smiles again. He took a small breath. "It's the first time it feels like we're home." The words, so pure and true, landed with the force of a gavel. Judge Peterson looked at the small boy, her stern expression melting into one of profound understanding. She cleared her throat, and when she spoke, her verdict was swift and absolute. Full custody was awarded to Clara. The war was over. 6 months later, as the first gentle snow of the next winter began to fall, their world was transformed. With Clara's joyful blessing, Mark had filed the paperwork and was now the legal guardian of Leo and Samuel. The cabin was no longer a temporary shelter, but a permanent home, filled with the chaotic, beautiful noise of a family. On a chilly December evening, they gathered around a freshly cut pine tree, Ghost supervising from the hearth. Mark lifted Leo to place a handmade star on the highest branch while Clara, holding a giggling Samuel, watched with a look of pure contentment. Mark looked from their smiling faces to the front door of the cabin. It was no longer a barrier against a harsh world, but an entrance to a place of safety and love, a door that would always remain open. Perhaps the greatest miracles are the quiet ones. The loyalty of a faithful dog who senses a need, the courage of a soldier finding a new mission, and the simple love that builds a home where there once was only a shelter from the storm. If this story brought a little warmth to your day, we hope you'll share it with someone who needs to be reminded that doors can open even after they have been closed. We invite you to join our Voice of Paws family by subscribing, and we would love to read in the comments about the loyal companion who stands by your side.